The floor was not merely cold. It was a thief of heat, leaching the warmth from Luther's cheek the moment he was thrown against it. He did not slide. The metal was textured with a microscopic grit, abrasive enough to scrape the skin off his palms as he tried to break his fall. He failed. His shoulder took the brunt of the impact, sending a jolt of white-hot pain shooting up his neck, followed immediately by the sound that signaled the end of his freedom. It was a heavy, pneumatic thud, followed by the grinding of magnetic locks engaging. 1, 2, 3. The sound was final. It was the sound of a coffin lid being nailed shut by an impatient undertaker. Luther lay still for a moment, tasting iron in his mouth. He did not panic. Panic burned oxygen, and in the bowels of the lattice arc, oxygen was likely a commodity, as measured and rationed as the nutrient paste. He pushed himself up his muscles, protesting the abuse they had suffered over the last 48 hours of capture and processing. He sat back on his heels, regulating his breathing. For 4 seconds. Hold for 4. Out for 4. The rescuer's mantra. It was the only thing keeping the screaming terror in the back of his mind from taking the wheel. The darkness in the cell was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against his eyes. It smelled of old blood copper and salt layered over the stinging chemical burn of cheap industrial disinfectant. But underneath that, there was something else. A scent that was musky, wild, and terrified. Luther froze. He was not alone. From the corner of the room, the deepest well of shadow, came a sound. It was a low, vibrating rumble, too deep to be a purr, too rhythmic to be a growl. It was a warning. And then he heard the breathing. It was not one set of lungs working in the dark. It was 2. "I know you are there," Luther whispered. His voice cracked dry as parchment. The response was a sharp hiss, followed by the scrape of claws on metal. Above them, the lighting strip flickered. It was a dying halogen bar, buzzing like an angry insect, before strobing into a sickly yellow life. The sudden illumination revealed the nightmare in high definition. They were huddled in the far corner, pressed against the riveted bulkhead, as if trying to merge with the steel. 2 of them, Faleri. Luther had seen Faleri before, mostly in the transit hubs of the mid-rim sectors, moving with a fluid grace that made humans look like stumbling, unrefined prototypes. But he had never seen them like this. The larger one, the one the guards had laughed about while betting on her survival, was a coil of tension. She was tall, her fur a sleek, dark obsidian that seemed to absorb the weak light. She was crouched on her haunches, muscles bunching beneath her skin like steel cables ready to snap. Her ears were flattened against her skull, and her lips were pulled back to reveal teeth that were definitely not designed for negotiation. This was Sable. But what caught Luther's eye was not her aggression. It was the dark, wet patch on her side. Her breathing was ragged, hitching with every inhalation, a telltale sign of a punctured rib, or worse. Next to her, half hidden by Sable's body, was the second one, smaller. Perhaps younger, though it was hard to tell with the alien physiology. Her fur was a mottled gray, and white like storm clouds breaking. If Sable was a coiled spring, this one, Junia, was a shattered mirror. Her eyes were wide, the pupils blown out so large that the golden irises were mere thin rings. She was shaking a constant, violent tremor that rattled her claws against the floor. "Feral," the guard had said when he shoved Luther in. "Try not to get eaten before the show starts." Luther slowly raised his hands, palms open, showing he held no weapon. "I am not going to hurt you," he said. He kept his voice level, the same tone he used when approaching a survivor trapped under collapsed rubble. Sable shifted, placing herself more firmly between Luther and the smaller female. A low growl ripped from her throat, escalating in volume. She looked ready to launch herself across the 3 meters of space separating them. Then the arc screamed. It was not a sound of metal, but a groan of gravity generators failing. The floor beneath Luther suddenly ceased to be down. The world tilted violently on its axis. Luther was lifted from the deck as if a giant hand had swatted gravity aside. His stomach lurched into his throat. He flailed, grabbing at empty air, his boots seeking purchase on a floor that was no longer there. Across the room, the two Falerii were thrown upward. Sable snarled, twisting in the air with feline agility, her claws sparking against the wall as she tried to find a grip. But Junia was lighter. The gravity shift launched her like a projectile. She flew across the room, tumbling uncontrollably. "Watch out!" Luther shouted, though to whom he was not sure. He slammed shoulder first into the ceiling, which was now acting as a wall, and the air left his lungs in a pained wheeze. A split second later, a mass of fur and muscle collided with him. It was Junia. She hit him hard, her limbs scrambling for purchase. For a heartbeat, Luther expected claws to shred his flight suit and the skin beneath. He braced for pain, but it did not come. Instead, her hands that were remarkably human in shape, despite the retractable claws, clamped onto the front of his jacket. She did not strike him. She buried her face in his chest, her entire body rigid. The gravity stabilizers groaned again, fighting the turbulence of the Veilstorm outside, and slowly, agonizingly, the room righted itself. They dropped to the floor in a heap. Luther landed on his back, winded again. Junia was sprawled on top of him. She was light, surprisingly, so her bone structure hollow and avian-like despite her predatory appearance. She was not attacking. She was listening. Luther lay perfectly still, staring up at the flickering light. He could feel the rapid-fire hammer of her heart against his ribs. It was beating so fast he feared it might burst. But as he lay there, forcing his own breathing to remain slow and rhythmic, he felt something change. Junia's ear, soft and tufted, twitched against his sternum. She was pressing her ear directly over his heart. Thump, 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 thump. It was the only steady rhythm in a world of chaos. "Get away from him!" A snarl cut through the air. Sable was on her feet, swaying slightly, her eyes burning with fever and rage. She did not lunge lightly, because the gravity shift had jarred her wound, but her intent was clear. Junia scrambled off Luther, retreating backward on all fours, with a speed that blurred the eye. She did not return to the corner, however. She stopped halfway, crouching, her gaze darting between Sable and Luther. Luther sat up slowly, rubbing his bruised chest. He looked at Junia. She was staring at him, or rather at his chest, with an expression of intense confusion. She brought a hand to her own chest, tapping it once, then looked back at him. "Yeah," Luther breathed, wincing as he shifted his leg. "I am alive." Surprise. He looked at Sable. The adrenaline of the fall had faded, and now the medical reality was setting in. The dark patch on her side was spreading. The smell of infection, sweet and rotting, was faint, but distinct to a nose trained in triage. "You are septic," Luther said, pointing a finger at her side. Sable bared her teeth, a warning hiss escaping her. She took a step back, stumbling. "If you do not clean, that you will be dead in 48 hours, Luther stated flatly. He did not use the soft voice of comfort now. He used the cold voice of fact. Maybe less if the fever spikes. He reached into his jacket. Immediately, Sable tensed her claws, extending fully. "Easy," Luther murmured. He moved with exaggerated slowness. "Just easy." From the inner lining of his battered pilot's jacket, he withdrew a small, vacuum-sealed pouch. It was his last resort kit. Every scavenger and rescuer in the Veilstorm kept one. It contained a collapsible flask of water, a single bioadhesive bandage, a small vial of broad-spectrum antiseptic, and a tube of nutrient paste that tasted like wet cardboard, but contained enough calories to keep a man moving for a day. He set the kit on the floor. "Water," Luther said, tapping the pouch. "Medicine," he pointed to the vial. "Food." He slid the items across the metal floor. They spun and came to a rest exactly between him and the Falerii. Sable looked at the items, then at Luther. Her eyes narrowed. To her, this was a trap. In the Ark, nothing was given. Everything was taken. I do not want anything from you, human, she might have been thinking, but the way her tongue darted out to lick her dry nose betrayed her thirst. Luther leaned back against the wall, crossing his arms. I am not asking for a trade. I am just tired of the smell of gangrene. It ruins the ambience. It was a lie, of course. He cared. It was his curse. He looked at the younger one, Junia. She was watching the nutrient tube with an intensity that was heartbreaking. She was starving. The hollows of her cheeks were visible even under the fur. Go on, Luther urged softly. Junia looked at Sable. The larger female remained rigid for a long moment, her chest heaving with the effort of standing. Then slowly, she gave a microscopic nod. Junia moved. She did not walk, she flowed. She was at the pile of supplies in a blink. She grabbed the nutrient tube and the water. But then she paused. Her large gold-ringed eyes turned to Luther. She crept closer. Luther held his breath. She was within arm's reach now. He could smell her dust-static electricity and fear. She reached out a hand. Her claws were retracted, her fingers long and slender, tipped with coarse tactile pads. She did not reach for his throat. She reached for his hand. Quick as a snake, she snatched the heavy leather work glove from Luther's left hand. Hey, Luther started instinctively pulling back, but she was already gone. Junia darted back to the shadows, clutching the glove to her chest like it was a holy relic. She buried her nose in the leather, inhaling deeply. It smelled of engine grease, old sweat, and Luther. Luther sat there, one hand bare and cold, the other gloved. He blinked. A laugh bubbled up in his throat, a hysterical, jagged thing that he had to forcefully swallow. Okay, he muttered to the empty air. Team-building exercises like this are usually banned on Earth. But sure, keep the glove. It matches your eyes. Junia tilted her head. She did not understand the words, but the tone, lack of aggression, a hint of weary amusement, seemed to puzzle her. She took a bite of the nutrient paste, tearing the plastic tube with her teeth, and then offered the rest to Sable. The lights flickered again, followed by a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Luther looked to his right. The metal bulkhead was not smooth. Under the grime, there were etchings, complex fractal geometric patterns that looked less like engineering schematics and more like circuitry grown from seeds. As his heart rate settled, slowing down to a resting rhythm, he noticed something impossible. The lines in the metal were glowing, faintly, a pulse of pale blue light that throbbed in perfect synchronization with his own heartbeat. Thump, thump. The wall pulsed. Thump, thump. The light expanded. He placed his bare hand against the cold metal. The vibration was palpable. It felt like the ship was purring against his palm. What is this place? Luther whispered. Before he could investigate further, a hiss of pneumatics cut through the silence. High up on the wall near the ceiling, a vent shutter snapped open. There was no fresh air, no oxygen cycle. Instead, a thick, pinkish mist began to spray into the room. The smell hit Luther instantly. It was sickeningly sweet, like overripe fruit left to rot in the sun, mixed with a sharp metallic tang that stung the back of his throat. Gas! Luther pulled the collar of his jacket up over his nose and mouth. Cover your faces. But the Phileri did not cover their faces. The effect on them was immediate and terrifying. Sable, who had slumped down to drink the water, suddenly arched her back. A guttural sound ripped from her throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated distress. Her pupils dilated until her eyes were black pools. The muscles in her arms rippled as spasms of chemically induced adrenaline flooded her system. The mist. It was not poison. It was a trigger. No, Luther realized with a sinking dread. The show. The curator had mentioned a performance. This was the catalyst. The gas was a pheromone synthesizer, an aggression and drive amplifier designed to strip away higher brain functions and leave only the raw feral instinct to fight or mate. Junia dropped the glove. She clawed at her own ears, shaking her head violently, as if trying to dislodge a buzzing insect from her brain. She screamed a high, piercing sound that sounded too much like a human child. Sable was gone. The intelligent, wary warrior, who had assessed the situation moments ago, was replaced by a biological weapon. She turned toward Luther. She did not see a man who had given her water. She saw a target. She saw an obstacle. She roared a sound that shook the rivets in the floor and launched herself. Luther scrambled backward, but the cell was too small. Sable, stop. She was on him. The weight was crushing. Luther threw his arms up to protect his throat. Her claws, fortunately, scrabbled against the thick, reinforced leather of his jacket sleeves. But the force of the impact drove the breath from him. He saw her face inches from his. Her jaws were open saliva, dripping from fangs that could puncture steel plate. But her eyes inside the black void of her dilated pupils, Luther saw a flicker of horror. She was trapped in her own body, a passenger in a vehicle that had been hijacked. "Get off!" Luther grunted, bringing his knee up to create space. He managed to shove her to the side, rolling away. He scrambled to his feet, putting the small metal bunk between them. Sable shook her head, growling, preparing to leap again. But she did not look at Luther. Her gaze snapped to the side, to Junia. The younger Falleri was writhing on the floor, the mist affecting her differently. She was not aggressive. She was terrified, hallucinating. She clawed at the air, backing into the corner where the mist was thickest. Sable's feral instinct locked onto the movement. Prey. Weakness. She crouched, her muscles coiling to spring at Junia. No, Luther didn't think. He didn't calculate the odds. He didn't weigh the survival probability. He moved. As Sable sprang, Luther threw himself into her path. He did not try to fight her. That was suicide. He acted as a shield. He collided with Sable in midair, wrapping his arms around her torso, using his own momentum to tackle her away from the smaller female. They hit the ground, hard. Luther felt a sharp pain flare in his forearm as a claw tore through the fabric and scored his skin. He grit his teeth, refusing to let go. "Sable, listen to me," Luther shouted into her ear, struggling to hold the thrashing alien. "This isn't you, it's the gas." She was too strong. She broke his grip with a heave of her shoulders that nearly dislocated his jaw. She spun around, pinning him to the floor. Her hand, a paw of deadly intent, raised claws, fully extended, ready to swipe his throat out. Luther stared up at death. But in that split second, he saw the wound on her side. The movement had torn the scab. Fresh blood was seeping out. He saw the bundle of nerves, just under the armpit, exposed by her raised arm. It was a pressure point. Universal physiology, where the brachial plexus met the cluster of lymph nodes. Luther's hand shot out. He didn't strike. He pressed. He drove his thumb into the nerve cluster, digging deep, finding the gap between the muscle groups, and squeezing with every ounce of strength he had left. Sable's eyes went wide. The roar died in her throat, replaced by a sharp gasp of shock. Her arm went limp, the neural signal cut off like a severed wire. The paralysis was temporary, only seconds, but it was enough. Her weight collapsed onto him, heavy and fever-hot. Luther lay there gasping for air, his hands still jamming the nerve cluster, shaking from the adrenaline dump. From the corner, a sound emerged. Luther turned his head, sweat stinging his eyes. Junia was standing there. She was no longer covering her ears. She was staring at Luther, staring at the man who had thrown himself between a monster and a ghost. Her mouth opened. Her vocal cords strained against the shape of words that were not designed for her throat. "Lou!" It was a growl. It was a whimper. But it was also a name. Luther. The single word hung in the sweet, poisonous air, more shocking than the violence, more profound than the silence. The mist swirled around them, but for the first time since the door had slammed shut, the darkness felt a little less absolute. The silence that followed the violence was heavier than the gravity plating beneath the deck. It was a tangible weight, pressing against Luther's eardrums, broken only by the ragged, wet rasp of Sable's breathing and the high-pitched whine of the ventilation system trying to scrub the last of the pheromone mist from the air. Luther did not move immediately. He remained frozen in the aftermath of the tackle, his hand still clamped over the nerve cluster under Sable's arm. He could feel the thrum of her biology beneath his fingertips, a pulse that was too fast, too erratic. It was like holding a live grenade that had the pin pulled, but the lever stuck halfway. Slowly, calculating the risk with every millimeter of movement, Luther eased the pressure. He waited for the snap of jaws or the slash of claws. He waited for the feral instinct to override the temporary paralysis. Nothing happened. Sable remained limp, a massive weight of muscle and fur draped across his legs. The chemical rage had burned itself out, leaving behind only the exhaustion of a body fighting a septic war against itself. Clear, Luther whispered to himself the word, forming a small cloud of condensation in the chilling air. He shifted, groaning, as his own bruises made themselves known. His shoulder throbbed where he had hit the wall, and his forearm, where Sable's claw had grazed him, was beginning to sting with a sharp, insistent heat. He gently rolled Sable off him, laying her on the cold metal floor. She made a sound in her throat, a low, pitiable whimper that sounded nothing like the apex predator she was supposed to be. It sounded like something small and lost. Luther sat back on his heels, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his uninjured hand. He looked toward the corner. Junia was there. The smaller Faliri was crouched on top of the ventilation, housing her limbs tucked tight against her body. Her eyes, those enormous pools of gold and black, were locked onto him. She was not growling. She was vibrating a high-frequency tremor that blurred her outline in the dim light. She looked like a frequency spike on a broken oscilloscope. "I am not going to hurt her," Luther said, his voice rough. He kept his hands, visible palms up. "And I am not going to hurt you. We are done with the wrestling match for today." Junia tilted her head. The movement was bird-like, sharp, and inquisitive. She did not relax, but she did not flee. Luther turned his attention back to Sable. Now that the adrenaline was fading, the medical reality of the situation was crashing down on him. The dark patch on her side was not just blood. It was a slurry of plasma and infection. The smell was distinct, sweet, cloying, and dangerous. "You are burning up," he murmured, hovering his hand over her flank. The heat radiating from her was intense. "If I leave that shrapnel in there, you will not wake up." He looked around the cell. It was a barren box of steel and misery. No medical bay. No sterile field. Just the last resort kit he had laid out earlier. Water, a single bandage, antiseptic, and nutrient paste. "Okay," Luther breathed, forcing his mind into the cold, compartmentalized state of emergency triage. "Improvise." He reached for the magnetic locking mechanism on his boot. With a sharp tug, he detached a small, flat strip of titanium alloy used to reinforce the ankle support. It was not a scalpel. It was barely a shim. But one edge was jagged where it had been worn down over years of spacewalks. He held the metal strip up to the flickering light. Crude, he judged. But it will cut. A low growl came from the vent. Luther froze. He looked up. Junia had moved. She was now on the floor halfway between him and the vent, her body lowered. Her gaze was fixed on the piece of metal in his hand. To her, it looked like a weapon. It looked like a knife he intended to plunge into her fallen companion. Luther understood the calculation she was making. He slowly lowered the metal strip. He needed to bridge the language barrier, and he needed to do it fast. He rolled up his left sleeve, revealing the fresh, angry scratch Sable had given him during the scuffle. It was not deep, but it was bleeding. "Watch," Luther said clearly. He took the vial of antiseptic from the floor. With deliberate, exaggerated movements, he uncorked it. He poured a few drops onto his own wound. The sting was immediate and vicious. Luther hissed through his teeth, his hand jerking involuntarily. "Mother of..." he muttered, blinking away the reflex tears. That stings. He looked at Junia. She had flinched when he hissed, her ears swiveling forward. See, Luther gestured to his arm. Medicine. Pain then better. Not a weapon. He then picked up the metal shim. He scraped it lightly against the fabric of his trousers, cleaning it as best he could, then poured the rest of the antiseptic over the metal. The liquid hissed as it hit the cold alloy. I am not making soup out of you, Luther said, his tone conversational despite the tension. I am just a mechanic who hates seeing broken things stay broken. Junia did not retreat. She watched him with an intensity that felt almost telepathic. Then, with a fluid motion, she shifted her position. She did not come to stop him. Instead, she moved to the far wall, positioning herself directly in front of the ventilation grate where the gas had come from. She sat there, her back to the wall, her eyes scanning the room, her ears swiveling like radar dishes. She was standing guard. Good girl, Luther whispered. He turned back to Sable. All right, Sleeping Beauty. This is going to hurt you more than it hurts me, which is a cliché, but in this case, accurate, he began. The procedure was a nightmare of tactile sensations. The filari skin was tougher than human skin, requiring more pressure than Luther wanted to apply. When the metal finally parted, the swollen tissue pus and dark blood welled up immediately. Luther worked by feel as much as by the dying light, his fingers digging into the alien musculature to find the foreign object. Sable whimpered in her unconscious state, her legs kicking out reflexively. Luther had to lean his weight across her hips to keep her steady. Almost there, he gritted out, sweat dripping from his nose onto the floor. Come on, come on. His fingertips brushed against something hard and jagged, buried deep near the ribcage. He hooked the metal shim under it. With a wet suction sound, he leveraged the debris out. It clattered onto the metal floor, a twisted piece of black polymer, likely a fragment of armor, driven in by an explosion. Got you, Luther exhaled. He quickly flushed the wound with the remaining water, though it was hardly enough, and slapped the bioadhesive bandage over the incision. It was a temporary fix for a permanent problem, but it bought time. He sat back, his hands shaking. His chest heaved. He felt lightheaded, the exertion burning through his meager calorie reserves. He looked over at Junia. She was still by the vent, but her head was turned toward him. She had watched the whole thing. She looked at the bloody piece of polymer on the floor, then at the bandage on Sable's side, and finally at Luther's blood-stained hands. For a moment, the alien and the human simply existed in the shared silence, bound by the universal language of pain and relief. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Time on the lattice arc was a fluid concept unmarked by a sun or a reliable clock. The only measure of time was the rhythmic thrum of the ship's engines and the gnawing emptiness in Luther's stomach. Luther dozed in short, fitful bursts, his back against the cold wall. He woke to the sound of movement. Sable was awake. She was trying to push herself up, her claws scraping against the floor plates. Her limbs were trembling, but the fever seemed to have broken, or at least retreated enough to give her back her mind. Easy, Luther said, keeping his voice low. He did not move toward her. He knew better than to startle a waking predator. You lost a lot of blood. Sable froze at the sound of his voice. Her head snapped toward him, her eyes narrowing. They were no longer black voids of dilated madness. They were sharp, vertical slits of amber and green. Intelligence had returned, and with it, suspicion. She looked down at her side, touching the strange, smooth surface of the biobandage. She sniffed it, her nose wrinkling at the antiseptic smell. Then she looked at the bloody shard of polymer, lying a few feet away. She pieced together the narrative in seconds. She looked at Luther. You, she rasped. Her voice was like grinding stones, deep, resonant, and painful. Why? I told you, Luther said, leaning his head back against the wall. I do not like the smell of gangrene. It is bad for morale. Sable stared at him. She tried to stand, her legs wobbling, but she forced herself upright through sheer force of will. She swayed, leaning against the bulkhead for support. "You had a knife," she said, nodding toward the metal shim Luther had cleaned and placed on his knee. "You could have ended it. A throat cut is cleaner than this." "I am not a butcher," Luther said. "I am a mechanic. I fix things. Sometimes people. Sometimes ships. Occasionally feral alien cats with attitude problems." Sable's lip curled, revealing the tip of a fang. "Feral," she spat the word. "Is that what you see?" "It is what the guards called you," Luther shrugged. "I was thinking of something else. Maybe silver for the way you look under these terrible lights, or shadow, since you seem to blend into the wall." Sable stared at him as if he had just suggested they dance a waltz. The look was one of utter bafflement, mixed with disdain. "Do not name me human," she growled softly. "I am not a pet to be called by the color of my coat." She took a breath, wincing as her ribs expanded. She looked toward the vent where Junia was curled up asleep, now that the immediate danger had passed. "Junia," Sable said. She pointed a claw at the sleeping form. Then she thumped her own chest with a closed fist. "Sable." It was not an offering of friendship. It was a statement of fact. It was the way a soldier identifies the assets on the field. "This is a mine. That is a rifle. I am Sable." "Luther," he replied, tapping his own chest. Sable held his gaze for a long second, assessing the threat level. Finally, she gave a single curt nod. The truce was acknowledged. Not signed, not celebrated, but acknowledged. Suddenly, the silence was shattered. The speaker grill, set high into the wall, crackled to life. It was not the static of interference. It was the sound of a channel opening. "Attention, esteemed guests and biological components," a voice purred. It was Curator Orin. His voice was smooth, cultured, and dripping with a synthetic warmth that made Luther's skin crawl. It sounded like velvet wrapped around a razor blade. "I trust you are settling into your accommodations," Orin continued. "I have been monitoring the biometric feeds. Fascinating. Truly fascinating. The adrenaline spikes, the cortisol levels you are painting are quite the masterpiece of stress down there." Luther stood up, walking to the center of the room and staring at the speaker. "If you want a show, buy a ticket, Orin. Let us out." "Out," Orin chuckled, a dry sound. "But you are exactly where you need to be. The arc requires motivation. It requires a bond forged in fire." The lights in the cell shifted, turning from yellow to a harsh combat red. "The pairing performance will commence in 12 hours, Orin announced. "Only the pairs that demonstrate true resonance, true cooperation will be granted access to the upper lattice. And more importantly, only they will be granted the hydration reward." Luther's eyes widened. He looked at the water dispenser in the corner of the cell. The small indicator light, which had been green, blinked once and turned dead black. "Effective immediately," Orin's voice hardened, losing the velvet. "Rations are suspended. Hunger makes the mind sharp. Thirst makes the will pliable. Learn to be one or die as 3 separate corpses. The Veilstorm waits for no one." The speaker clicked off. The silence that returned was different now. It was not heavy. It was hollow. It was the silence of a clock ticking down in an empty room. Luther walked over to the dispenser and pressed the button. Nothing. Not even a hiss of air. "He is starving us," Luther said quietly. Sable slid down the wall to a sitting position, her energy spent. "He is breaking us," she corrected. "It is the Curator's way. He believes the only bond strong enough to steer this ship is a bond of desperation." "You know him?" Luther asked, sitting opposite her, keeping a respectful distance. "I know his type," Sable said. She looked at her hands, claws retracted but shaking slightly. "He thinks he is a god because he holds the keys to the cage," Luther sighed, rubbing his face. "I used to work salvage," he said, staring at the floor. "Deep space wrecks, the kind where the distress beacon has been beeping for 50 years. I would go in, cut through the bulkheads, find the crew. He paused. Usually, they were long gone. But sometimes you find the ones who survived by doing things they could never forget. I saw what happens when people let the survival part eat the human part. They survive, yeah. But they do not live. They just become biological mechanisms. He looked up at Sable. I promised myself I would never do that. I would never let the math of survival subtract the decency out of me. Orin is exactly what I am afraid of becoming. Sable listened. For the first time, her ears were perked forward, fully attentive. She was not looking at him as a prey animal or a threat. She was looking at him as another sentient being carrying a heavy load. I was a shield bearer, Sable said softly. Her voice was distant. For Matriarch Selene. When the Veil Storm hit our convoy, we were separated. My job was simple, be the wall between her and the void. She traced the edge of the bandage on her side. We were ambushed, scavengers. They used sonic charges. I was disoriented. I fell. When I woke up, the Matriarch was gone and I was in chains. I did not die for her. I lived. That is my crime. That is not a crime, Luther said firmly. That is just bad luck. For a Faliri shield bearer, there is no difference, Sable replied bitterly. I sleep and I see her face. I wake and I feel the shame. That is why I do not sleep, Luther. Dreams are just another cage. From the corner, a soft sound emerged. Luther and Sable both turned. Junia was awake. She had crawled out from her guard post by the vent and was sitting a few feet away from Luther. She was staring at his chest, watching the rise and fall of his jacket. She took a breath in. 1, 2, 3, 4. She held it. 1, 2, 3, 4. She released it. 1, 2, 3, 4. She was mimicking Luther's breathing technique, the one he had used to calm himself when the door first slammed shut. Luther blinked. She is copying me. She is anchoring, Sable observed, her eyes widening slightly. Junia has always been sensitive. The Veil Storm speaks to her too loudly. She hears the songs of the stars and they scream at her. She needs a rhythm to drown them out. Junia shifted closer. She did not touch Luther, but she leaned in her ear, tilting toward him, catching the sound of his respiration. The arc, Luther realized. The walls. They pulse with a rhythm. Maybe she hears that too. Maybe, Sable said. Or maybe she just hears the only thing in this room that isn't trying to kill her. Suddenly, the hiss returned. The vent above them sputtered. A puff of pink mist, smaller than before, a warning shot, drifted down. Luther scrambled back, covering his nose. Gas mask up. But Sable did not recoil this time. Her eyes began to dilate, the chemical trigger slamming into her brain. Her muscles bunched. The growl started deep in her chest. Sable, Luther shouted. Fight it, look at me. You are a shield bearer, not a beast. Sable's head snapped up. She was trembling violently, her claws digging into the metal floor until sparks flew. She was fighting a war inside her own skull. I am, she ground out, saliva dripping from her fangs. She looked at Luther. She looked at his neck, the vulnerable pulse point. The pheromones screamed at her to tear, to bite, to dominate. But then she looked at Junia. Junia, who was terrified, curled into a ball. Sable roared, a sound of frustration and defiance. She did not lunge at Luther. Instead, she threw herself forward, but not to attack. She collided with him, but she did not bite. She slammed her forehead against the center of his chest, right over his sternum. She pressed hard, pinning him against the wall with the weight of her skull. Hold still, she hissed into his jacket. She shut her eyes tight. She was using the physical impact, the sensation of his heartbeat, as a metronome to counter the chaotic noise in her blood. Thump, thump. Luther's heart beat against her forehead. Thump, thump. Luther sat frozen, his hands hovering over her shoulders, unsure whether to push her away or hold her. He chose the latter. He slowly lowered his hands, resting them tentatively on her trembling shoulders. I am here, he whispered. I am not moving. Junia, seeing this, scrambled over. She did not hide. She pressed herself against Luther's side, burying her face in the crook of his arm, adding her own rapid heartbeat to the mix. For a moment, the three of them were a single, tangled knot of biology fur, skin leather, and fear. And then, the room changed. The vibration in the walls, the constant low-level hum of the Ark's engines, shifted. The frantic, discordant buzzing that had plagued the room since the gas started suddenly smoothed out. The lights stopped flickering. The floor plates ceased their microscopic trembling. The Ark sensed the resonance. It felt the synchronization of three heartbeats, finding a common rhythm in the dark. The ship purred. It was a sound of recognition. The mist stopped spraying. Sable let out a long, shuddering breath, her forehead still pressed against Luther's chest. The feral tension drained out of her, leaving her heavy and exhausted. "It stopped," she whispered, her voice muffled by his jacket. "Yeah," Luther breathed, looking up at the now steady light. It stopped. He looked down at the two deadly aliens clinging to him, like castaways on a raft. He realized with a jolt that Orin was wrong. Desperation hadn't forged this bond. Trust, fragile, bloody, and improvised, had. "Get some sleep, Sable," Luther said softly. "I will take the first watch." Sable did not argue. For the first time since the ambush that took her matriarch, the shield-bearer allowed her eyes to close, lulled by the steady, unyielding rhythm of a human heart. The silence that preceded the opening of the cell door was not empty. It was pressurized. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a deep-sea vessel before the hull rushed inward. Luther sat with his back against the cold metal of the bunk, his legs extended, feigning the posture of a defeated man. But, under his jacket, his muscles were coiled tight, and his eyes were fixed on the magnetic locking mechanism 3 meters away. Sable was nowhere to be seen. To the untrained eye, the cell looked occupied only by a despondent human mechanic. But Luther knew she was pressed into the upper corner of the ceiling arch, defying gravity with the sheer strength of her claws and core muscles, a drop predator waiting for the trigger. Junia was low-tucked behind the waste reclamation unit, a small ball of potential energy that vibrated against the floor plates. "Showtime," Luther whispered. The heavy thud of the magnetic bolts retracting echoed through the block. 1, 2, 3. The heavy blast door hissed open, sliding into the wall with a grind of unlubricated steel. The corridor outside was bathed in the harsh, sterile white of detention lighting. 2 drones hovered in the threshold. They were sleek, nasty pieces of engineering, matte black spheroids, armed with stun batons and crowd control webbing projectors. They scanned the room with a singular robotic malice, their optical sensors glowing a threatening crimson. "Subject 734, a synthesized voice announced from the lead drone. "Proceed to the arena for pairing assessment. Non-compliance will result in—" "Sorry," Luther interrupted, his voice steady. "We are experiencing technical difficulties." He kicked out his heel. It was a small movement, but it was the culmination of 6 hours of agonizingly subtle work. He had jammed a conductive shim stripped from the edge of his boot heel into the exposed floor circuitry he had pried open earlier. He drove his heel down, bridging the connection between the door's power coupling and the localized ground. Crack, zat. A cascade of blue sparks erupted from the floor plate. The surge did not just short the door. It sent a high-voltage spike back up the power tether that the drones were wirelessly sipping from. The lead drone convulsed. Its stabilizers whined in a high-pitched death rattle, and it dipped low, its sensors flickering wildly. "Now!" Luther shouted. Sable dropped. She did not fall. She descended like a guillotine blade. She landed squarely on top of the lead drone, her claws fully extended. Metal screeched against metal, a sound that set Luther's teeth on edge as she drove her hand through the drone's chassis, ripping out its primary logic core in a spray of sparks and hydraulic fluid. She used the momentum of the crash to kick off the falling wreckage, launching herself at the second drone. It attempted to deploy a stun net, but it was too slow. Sable was a blur of obsidian fur and violence. She twisted in the air, her tail acting as a rudder, and slammed her feet into the drone's sensor array, driving it back into the corridor wall with a resounding crunch. Luther was already moving. He scrambled across the floor, sliding under the sparking remains of the first drone. He wasn't looking for a weapon. He was looking for access. Junia, the sensors. The small Faliri darted from her hiding spot. She moved differently than Sable. Sable was power. Junia was flow. She slipped past the wreckage and into the hallway, flattening herself against the wall, just below the camera array that monitored the cell block. She leaped, finding purchase on the smooth wall, where no purchase should exist, and slashed the fiber optic cabling running along the conduit. The red recording light on the camera died instantly. Luther grabbed the chassis of the first drone. His fingers, scarred and nimble from years of salvaging wrecks in zero gravity, found the maintenance port. He ripped the cover off. Come on, he muttered, using the tip of the metal shim to bridge the security override pins. Do not be proprietary with me. The drone's internal gyro spun up, but its weapons remained offline. Luther bypassed the targeting matrix and hot-wired the access transponder. He pulled the drone's identity card, a small, glowing chip, from its slot. Got it, Luther exhaled. He stood up, holding the chip like a trophy. Sable was standing over the ruin of the second drone, breathing hard, a trickle of blue hydraulic fluid staining her dark fur. She looked at Luther, her eyes wild, the adrenaline of the fight, warring with the lingering effects of her infection. That was loud, she rasped. Loud is good, Luther said, moving to the door panel. He jammed the stolen chip into the reader. Loud covers the sound of us breaking the rules. He punched in a command sequence he had memorized from watching the guard's fingers over the last 2 days. Maintenance override. Block A. Release all. I swear, Luther muttered as the console chirped a happy confirmation. I am only really qualified to fix coffee machines and toaster ovens. This hero stuff is going to void my warranty. Down the long, curved corridor of the Ark, the lights shifted from white to a flashing emergency amber. And then came the sound. Clunk hiss, clunk hiss, clunk hiss. It was the sound of 200 cell doors opening simultaneously. For a second, there was silence. Then a roar erupted. It was a primal sound, a mixture of rage, relief, and confusion from hundreds of throats belonging to a dozen different species. You opened them all, Sable asked, her ears flattening against the noise. Chaos is the best camouflage, Luther said. He grabbed her shoulder, checking her bandage quickly. It was holding, though blood was seeping through the edges. We cannot fight the whole ship, Sable. We need an army, or at least a really big distraction. Hey you, the guy with the cat ladies. A human scrawny with hair that looked like it had been cut with a dull knife, and eyes that darted around like trapped birds, came skidding out of the cell next to theirs. He was wearing a prisoner jumpsuit that was 3 sizes too big. You did this. You popped the locks. The man grabbed Luther's arm, his grip surprisingly strong, for someone who looked like a stiff breeze would knock him over. I'm Milo. Theft, petty larceny, and 1 count of accidental orbital bombardment. I'm sticking with you. Accidental orbital bombardment, Luther frowned, pulling his arm free. It was a very big button and it was red. Who makes a button red if you aren't supposed to push it? Milo babbled, looking at Sable with terror. Is she going to eat me? She looks like she eats people. I'm high in cholesterol, just so you know. Bad for the heart. She might if you do not stop talking, Luther said, pushing Milo behind him. Suddenly a panel in the wall popped open with a pneumatic hiss. It wasn't a door. It was a service hatch for the electrical conduits. A head popped out. It was pale, hairless, and possessed large, multifaceted eyes that blinked independently. The creature had 4 arms, 2 of which were currently holding a tangle of copper wire. Inefficient, the creature said. Its voice was a synthesized buzz. Shorting the ground loop caused a 19% drop in efficiency for the life support recyclers in this sector. Sloppy work. I was in a hurry, Luther defended himself instinctively. The creature pulled itself out of the hatch. It was wearing a modified technician's harness. I am Astor, systems engineer, 3rd class, currently incarcerated for optimizing the curator's personal shuttle without permission. Optimizing? Luther asked. It went faster. Astor shrugged with all 4 shoulders. Then it exploded. But for 3 seconds it was very fast. Astor looked at the open cells, then at the chaos erupting down the hall, where prisoners were beginning to clash with the drone reinforcements. If you are planning to run to the hangar bay, the probability of survival is less than 4%. The drone phalanx is already deploying. Luther looked at the corridor. He saw the tide of prisoners, massive scaled hulks, insectoid swarm fighters, and desperate humans charging toward the main lifts. They were angry, but they were unorganized. They were running straight into the meat grinder. We are not going to the hangar, Luther said, his voice hardening. He looked at Sable, then Junia. We are going to the source. The Songkor, Junia whispered. It was the first time she had spoken clearly since the Luther incident. Her voice was melodic, almost like a hum. Luther nodded. The gas, the gravity, the locks. It is all controlled from the central resonance chamber. If we want to survive this, we do not just escape. We take the wheel. That is suicide, Milo squeaked. That's in the middle of the curator's territory. That's where the fancy guards with the real guns hang out. Then we need a shield, Luther said. He scanned the crowd. He spotted a figure dominating the center of the hallway. It was an older man, a human with skin like weathered leather, and a cybernetic brace on his left leg. He was using a detached metal bunk rail to smash a drone out of the air. Garen, Luther shouted. The big man turned. He recognized Luther from the brief interactions in the exercise yard. Mechanic, Garen bellowed, kicking a drone into the wall. You did this. We are going to the core, Luther shouted over the din of combat. We are cutting the gas. I need a wedge. Garen looked at the chaos, then at Luther's small, ragged team. He grinned, revealing a set of steel teeth. Better than dying in a cage, prisoners on me, wedge formation. We are clearing a path. The prisoners rallied. It wasn't loyalty. It was the magnetic pull of a plan in a vacuum of panic. Garen took the lead, a battering ram of flesh and metal. Sable, take point, Luther ordered. Garen's team is the shield. You are the spear. Junia, stay in the middle. Milo, try not to die. Astor, you are with me. We need a route that does not appear on the tourist map. The maintenance substrata, Astor buzzed. Thermal levels are high, but security density is low. Lead the way, Luther said. They moved. The journey into the maintenance tunnels was like descending into the throat of a dying beast. The air here was thick with ozone and the smell of superheated coolant. The tunnels were narrow, lined with pipes that hissed and groaned under the strain of the Ark's operation. The temperature spiked. Sweat soaked through Luther's jacket within minutes. Milo was panting heavily, his face red. Why is it so hot? Milo wheezed. The veil storm, Astor replied, without slowing down, scuttling along the wall pipes like a spider. The Ark is diverting power to the structural integrity fields. The cooling systems are secondary. If the shields fail, we will not roast. We will simply cease to exist biologically. Comforting, Luther muttered. The Ark was louder down here. The vibration that Luther had felt in the cell was a roar in the tunnels. It wasn't just mechanical noise. It was a rhythmic oscillating sound that seemed to have a melody. Whom thrum, whom thrum. Junia was struggling. She walked with her hands pressed tight over her ears, her eyes squeezed shut, guided only by Sable's hand on her shoulder. It hurts her, Sable said, her voice tight with worry. The song. It is too loud. It's not just a song, Luther realized. looking at the pulsing lights running along the conduits. It's data. The whole ship is talking to itself, trying to keep the storm out. Junia hears the raw code. He reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 small pieces of dense foam he had scavenged from the drone's packing material earlier. Junia, Luther said gently, stepping in front of her. She flinched, opening one eye. Earplugs, Luther said. It will not stop it, but it will muffle the high frequencies. He gently placed the foam into her sensitive, tufted ears. Junia blinked. Her shoulders dropped an inch as the sharpest edge of the noise was blunted. She looked at Luther, her golden eyes wide with a mixture of pain and gratitude. She reached out and briefly touched his chest, right over his heart, checking his rhythm. Keep moving, Luther said, though his voice was soft. They reached a junction. A large holographic emitter suspended from the ceiling flickered to life, blocking their path with a wall of blue light. The face of Curator Orin appeared. He was immense, 3 meters tall in projection, his features smoothed by digital enhancement. He was sitting in a high-backed chair, swirling a glass of clear liquid. Impressive, Orin's voice boomed, echoing down the metal tunnel. Most rats simply run for the nearest hole. You seem intent on climbing up the pantry shelf. The group halted. Garen raised his metal bar, but you couldn't hit a hologram. Open the blast doors, Orin, Luther said, stepping to the front. The Veilstorm is tearing the hull plating. I can hear the stress fractures from here. You are not saving the ship. You are cooking it. Orin smiled, a gesture that did not reach his cold, dead eyes. The Ark requires unity, Luther. It requires a singular will. You are creating dissonance, chaos. He leaned forward, the hologram looming over them. Turn back. Return to your cells. I will offer a deal. You, the Faliri, and your eclectic friends. Full rations. Water. A guaranteed spot on the bridge when we cross the Veil. All you have to do is accept the resonance. Submit to the bond. Sable snarled the sound, low and dangerous. We do not submit. You are delaying the inevitable, Orin sighed. I can vent this tunnel into space in 30 seconds. I am offering you mercy. Luther looked at the projection. He looked at the confident tilt of Orin's head. You are not offering mercy, Luther said, his voice cutting through the hum of the tunnel. You are scared, Orin's smile twitched. Scared? You are watching the sensors, Luther said, pointing at the flickering edges of the hologram. The Ark isn't responding to you anymore, is it? You are forcing the controls, but the ship is fighting back. You need us. You need the bond because you do not have one. You are alone in that tower, Orin. Luther stepped through the hologram, disrupting the light, scattering Orin's face into pixels. I do not need your resonance, Luther said to the empty air as the image reformed behind him. And I do not need your rations. I need an audience, and I am coming up to the stage. He waved the group forward. Aster, how far? 200 meters, Aster replied. Vertical climb. The song core is directly above the main reactor linkage. Let's go. The climb was grueling. The ladder was slick with condensation and oil. By the time they reached the access hatch to the song core, Luther's muscles were screaming, and Sable's bandage was soaked through with fresh blood. Garen and his improvised squad took up positions at the bottom of the shaft. We will hold the tunnel, Garen shouted up. If any drones come up this pipe, we will turn them into scrap metal. Give us 5 minutes, Luther called back. He spun the wheel on the hatch. It was heavy, requiring both him and Sable to turn. With a groan of protesting metal, the seal broke. Light flooded out. Not the harsh white of the prison, nor the amber of the alarm. This was a soft, pulsating bioluminescent blue. They pulled themselves up into the room. Luther stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The song core was not a bridge. It was a cathedral. The room was vast, spherical, and lined with thousands of crystalline rods that stretched from floor to ceiling. They hummed, vibrating with the ship's energy. In the center of the room was a console, but it looked more like an organ made of glass and light. Streams of data flowed through the air like liquid mercury. "It is beautiful," Milo whispered, forgetting to be afraid for a second. "It is a target," Sable corrected her eyes, scanning the periphery. "Hostiles?" Aster buzzed. From the shadows of the crystalline pillars, the Curator's elite guard emerged. These weren't drones. They were biological armored in sleek white ceramic plates, wielding shock pikes. "For the Ark!" the lead guard shouted. "Sable!" Luther yelled. He didn't need to give an order. She was already moving. Despite her injury, despite the fever that must have been burning her blood, she was magnificent. She moved through the field of crystalline rods like water, using the environment to shield her approach. Luther turned to the console. "Aster, keep them off me. Milo, throw something." "Throw what my dignity!" Milo shrieked, but he grabbed a loose piece of conduit and hurled it at a guard who was aiming a suppressor rifle at Luther. It missed, but it made the guard flinch enough for Junia to dart in. Junia didn't fight. She screamed. She let out a sonic pulse of Filari ability Luther hadn't seen yet. It wasn't loud, but it was pitched perfectly to shatter concentration. The guards stumbled, clutching their helmets. Luther reached the console. There were no buttons, no joysticks, just a smooth, undulating surface of light. "How do I fly this thing?" Luther muttered, his hands hovering over the surface. "You do not fly it," Aster yelled, firing a bolt from a stolen drone pistol. "You play it. It responds to biological rhythm resonance." Luther placed his hands on the surface. Zing. The reaction was instantaneous. The light shot up his arms, turning his veins a glowing blue. He gasped, his back arching. He didn't feel heat. He felt connection. He felt the hull plates groaning 3 kilometers away. He felt the air cycling in the hydroponics bay. He felt the drones swarming in the lower levels. And he felt the mist. He could see the schematic of the pheromone system. It was a red, angry knot in the ship's nervous system. "Come on," Luther gritted his teeth, forcing his mind to focus. "Turn it off." The machine resisted. It was locked by Orin's command codes. It felt like trying to push open a door held by a giant. "Luther," Sable's voice was strained. He glanced back. She was fighting 2 guards at once. She was slowing down. A shock pike grazed her leg, sending her stumbling. "I need more," Luther groaned. "It is too heavy." He felt a small hand on his back, then another on his arm. Junia pressed herself against his left side. Sable, having kicked a guard away, stumbled back and placed her hand on his right shoulder. Their heartbeats hit him like physical blows. Thump, 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 thump. The 3 rhythms human feral warrior converged. They didn't sync perfectly. They syncopated. They created a complex jazz-like polyrhythm that was far more intricate than the singular droning beat Orin had been forcing on the ship. The console flared white. The resistance vanished. Luther pushed his will into the machine. Stop the gas. Release the locks. Clunk. Throughout the ship, the vents hissed one last time and fell silent. The red, angry knot on the schematic dissolved. "We did it," Milo cheered from behind a pillar. "We didn't die. I am going to write a very positive review about this part." Luther slumped against the console, the lights fading from his veins. Sable caught him before he hit the floor. "You stopped the mist," she said, looking at him with a mixture of awe and something terrifyingly like fear. She had seen him glow. She had seen the ship embrace him. "Yeah," Luther breathed, wiping blood from his nose. "Show's over." The ship lurched. Not a gravity failure this time. A turn. The floor tilted 20 degrees. Luther slid, grabbing the console for support. "What was that?" Garen's voice crackled over the comms unit Aster had rigged. "Mechanic, the stars are moving sideways." Aster scrambled to a sensor readout. Her multifaceted eyes whirled frantically. "Warning!" Aster buzzed, her voice dropping an octave. "The automated navigation has disengaged, but the proximity alarm is triggered." "Proximity to what?" Luther asked, pulling himself up. Aster pointed to the main view screen that dominated the upper dome of the room. The blast shields retracted. Outside space was not black. It was a churning, violent violet. Ribbons of energy the size of planetary systems were whipping against the Ark's shields. "The Veil Storm," Sable whispered. "It is not just approaching," Aster said, her hands flying over the controls. "The Ark has pivoted. We are not turning away from it, Luther." Aster looked at him, and for the first time the alien engineer looked terrified. "We are diving straight into it. Impact in 5 minutes." Luther looked at the swirling chaos outside, then at the console he had just mastered. He had won the battle for the mist, but the war for the ship had just begun. Orin Luther realized cold dread pooling in his stomach. He didn't need the gas to kill us. He just needed to keep us busy while he aimed the ship at the grave. The transition from the suffocating ozone-heavy tunnels of the lower decks to the hydroponics bay was like stepping from a submarine into a rainforest. The air here was thick, humid, and smelled aggressively of life, wet soil, crushing greenery, and the faint, sweet decay of compost. It was a sensory shock after days of breathing recycled metal and fear. The prisoners, now refugees, had claimed the bay. What was once a pristine, automated garden designed to grow exotic flora for the curator's private collection had become a chaotic, sprawling village of hammock tents and makeshift triage centers. The glowing UV strips above cast a perpetual soft twilight over the leaves, banishing the harsh, interrogating glare of the cell blocks. Luther knelt by a hydroponic trough, his hands deep in the tangle of wiring that controlled the irrigation pump. He was exhausted. It was a bone-deep weariness that made his eyelids feel like they were made of lead. He had been awake for nearly 30 hours, moving from fixing the atmospheric scrubbers to stitching up lacerations on prisoners who had taken the brunt of the drone assault. "Blue wire to the bypass," he muttered to himself, his voice raspy. "Red wire to the hope and prayers circuit." He twisted the connections and taped them with a strip of adhesive he had scavenged. The pump sputtered, coughed like a drowning man, and then began to hum a steady, rhythmic gurgle of water, flowing to the thirsty roots of star melons and tuber vines. "You talk to the machines," a voice chimed in. "Do they ever talk back, or are they rude?" Luther wiped grease across his forehead and looked up. Milo was standing there, holding a tray of half-ripe fruit and a pouch of water. The scrawny inmate looked cleaner than before, though his oversized jumpsuit was now tied at the waist with a vine to keep it from falling off. "They talk back," Luther said, accepting the water. "Usually they say, 'Luther, go to sleep,' or 'Luther, you are voiding the warranty.'" "The plants say thank you," Milo said, gesturing to the greenery. "Or maybe that is just the oxygen deprivation talking. Either way, eat. Garen says if the mechanic dies, he will spacing me out the airlock for letting it happen." Luther took a bite of the fruit. It was sour, but the sugar hit his bloodstream like a jumpstart. He looked around the bay. It was a fragile piece. In one corner, a group of insectoid inmates were weaving sleeping mats from stripped palm fronds. In another, Garen was holding court, his massive frame, sitting on a crate of fertilizer, mediating a dispute between two factions over sleeping space. And patrolling the perimeter was Sable. Luther watched her. She had discarded the tattered remnants of her prison restraints. Now she wore a vest improvised from a drone's chest plate and leather straps. She moved with a prowling grace, her eyes scanning every shadow, every cluster of refugees. A week ago, she would have solved problems with her claws. Just an hour ago, Luther had seen a large reptilian inmate try to steal a ration pack from a weaker prisoner. Sable had intercepted him. She didn't strike. She simply stepped into his path, her amber eyes locking onto his, and emitted a low, vibrating growl that resonated in the chest cavity of everyone within 10 meters. The reptile had dropped the pack and retreated terrified. She was learning. She was becoming a leader, not just a killer. "She is staring at you again," Milo whispered, leaning in conspiratorially. "The scary one. She checks on you every 12 minutes. I timed it. She is checking security, Milo, Luther said, though he felt a flush of heat on his neck. Right. Security. The security of your face, Milo grinned. And the little one? She is worse. As if summoned, Junia appeared from beneath the broad leaves of a fern. She didn't walk. She materialized. She was carrying a small, polished metal cog she had found somewhere. She walked up to Luther and held it out. Fix, she said. It was a command, but her voice was soft, melodic. Luther took the cog. It was perfectly fine. It is not broken, Junia. Fix, she repeated, pointing to his chest. Luther smiled tiredly. She didn't mean the cog. She meant she wanted the ritual. She wanted the proximity. He patted the empty space on the crate beside him. Junia scrambled up, tucking her knees to her chest. She leaned over and pressed her ear against his sternum, right over his heart. Thump, thump. Thump, thump. She closed her eyes, letting out a long breath. Her own breathing synchronized with his. See, Milo whispered loudly. Biological heater, a white noise machine made of meat. You are a piece of furniture to them, Luther. I have been called worse, Luther murmured, resting his hand gently on Junia's head, careful of her sensitive ears. The piece, however, was an illusion. The ground beneath them trembled. It was a subtle vibration, at first rippling through the water in the hydroponic troughs, but it grew until the metal leaves of the support beams rattled. The UV lights flickered. Luther stood up gently, dislodging Junia. Aster. What is the status? Aster, the four-armed engineer, was perched on a high gantry, plugged into a wall terminal. Her multifaceted eyes spun. The Veilstorm is compressing the outer hull. Aster's synthesized voice buzzed over the localized intercom. Shield integrity is at 40%. The Ark is drifting deeper into the anomaly. We are not sailing, Luther. We are sinking. The council room was a cleared circle in the center of the bay, surrounded by tall stalks of corn-like alien plants. It was here that the fate of the 300 survivors was being debated. Garen stood in the center, his metal leg gleaming under the lights. We take the escape pods, he argued, his voice booming. We launch in a cluster. The Veilstorm is dense, yes, but if we fire all decoys, 50% of us might make it to the clear space. 50%, Luther repeated, standing opposite him. And the other 50, the wounded, the ones whose physiology cannot handle the G-force of a pod launch. What about them? Better half survive than all die, a prisoner shouted from the back. The pods are not designed for the Veil, Aster interjected her fingers, manipulating a holographic projection of the ship. The navigational sensors on the pods are basic. In the storm, they will be blind. The probability of collision with debris or re-entry into the distortion field is 90%. So we stay on this flying coffin. Garen slammed his fist into his palm. The curator locked the bridge. We cannot steer the Ark. We do not need the bridge, Luther said quietly. We need the song core. We proved it. We can manipulate the ship's systems through resonance. You turned off the gas mechanic, Garen scoffed. Turning off a valve is different from piloting a city-sized dreadnought through a gravitational hurricane. You need a connection stronger than just holding hands. We build the connection, Luther insisted. We practice. The Ark was built to be piloted by a bonded crew. We can be that crew. It is a risk, Garen growled. You are asking us to bet our lives on your ability to sing a lullaby to a computer. I am asking you to bet on each other, Luther said. He looked around the circle of faces, scared, angry, desperate. If we take the pods, we are just rats fleeing a sinking ship. We leave the weak behind. We leave our humanity behind. Is that how you want to survive, by being the ones who ran? The room fell silent. Sable stepped forward from the shadows. She did not shout. She did not posture. She simply stood next to Luther. I have run before, she said, her voice raspy but clear. I ran from the duty of the shield. It did not save me. It only made the cage inside my head smaller. She looked at Garen. We stay. We fight the storm. Together. Garen looked at Sable, then at Luther. He spat on the ground, then nodded slowly. Fine. We try it your way, mechanic. But if the hull starts buckling, I am putting you in a pod and firing you into a sun myself. Later, the bay quieted down as the artificial night cycle began. The lights dimmed to a deep, bioluminescent purple. Luther sat on the edge of a medical cot unwrapping the bandage on his hand. The burns from the electrical short in the cell block were healing, but slowly. His hands shook a tremor of exhaustion he couldn't suppress. You are shaking. Luther looked up. Sable was standing there. She held a fresh roll of sterile gauze and a small pot of herbal salve Aster had synthesized from the plants. Just tired, Luther said, trying to steady his hand. Sit, Sable commanded. She sat on the crate opposite him. She took his hand in hers. Her paws were rough, the pads calloused from a lifetime of combat, but her touch was shockingly gentle. Her claws were fully retracted. She dipped a finger into the salve and applied it to his burn. The coolness was instant relief. Luther watched her. Her face was inches from his. He could see the intricate patterns of fur on her cheeks, the way her pupils adjusted to the dim light. You were good today, Luther said softly. With the reptile. You didn't hurt him. I wanted to, Sable admitted without looking up. The instinct was there. To tear. To end the threat. But, she paused, wrapping the gauze around his palm with precision. I heard your voice, in my head. I am not a butcher. And I thought perhaps I do not have to be one either. You are a protector, Sable, Luther said. There is a difference. She finished the bandage and looked up. Their eyes met. The air between them felt charged heavy with the unsaid things that had accumulated over the days of survival. Luther's thumb brushed the back of her hand. It was an unconscious movement, a human gesture of comfort. Sable froze. She looked at his thumb, then at his face. She didn't pull away. You are strange, Luther, she whispered. You are soft. You break easily. You have no claws. And yet you stand in front of the storm. I am terrified, Luther admitted, a small, crooked smile touching his lips. I am just good at pretending I am not. He gestured to the faint white line on his forearm, the scar from where she had scratched him in the cell. Though honestly, I am more afraid of you than the storm. If you scratch me again, at least sign it. I want people to know I was mauled by a celebrity. Sable blinked. A sound rumbled in her chest. A short, sharp exhalation. She was laughing. It was a rusty, unfamiliar sound, but it was there. If I sign it, she murmured, leaning in slightly, I will carve it deep enough so you never forget. I do not think I could forget you, even if I tried, Luther said. The playfulness vanished. The moment stretched fragile and terrifyingly intimate. Luther leaned in, drawn by a gravity that had nothing to do with the ship. Boom! The Ark screamed. The floor buckled upwards, throwing them apart. The lights failed completely, plunging the bay into darkness before the emergency red strobes kicked in. Hull breach! Aster's voice shrieked over the comms. Sector 4. The Veilstorm is bleeding through. It wasn't just a physical breach. It was a psychic one. As the Veilstorm's radiation poured into the ship, reality warped. The air shimmered with oil-slick colors. Luther fell to his knees, clutching his head. No. The hydroponics bay dissolved. He wasn't on the Ark. He was underwater. Cold, freezing black water. He was back on the Orion, the first ship he had ever failed to salvage. He saw the face. A young woman trapped behind a jammed airlock. The water was rising. She was screaming, but no sound came out. He was pounding on the glass, his wrench useless, against the pressure seal. Open. 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 I can't, Luther screamed, his voice echoing in the hydroponics bay, though in his mind, he was drowning. "I'm sorry I can't reach you." The guilt crashed into him like a tidal wave. He was useless. He was a fraud. He saved people to make up for the one he let die, but the debt was never paid. "Luther." The voice was distant. He curled into a ball, the cold water filling his lungs. He couldn't breathe. He was dying. He deserved to die. Suddenly warmth. Something hot and solid slammed into him. Arms, strong, furry, undeniable, wrapped around him. "Luther, look at me." The water receded. The face behind the glass faded, replaced by amber eyes, burning with intensity. Sable was holding him. She was on her knees, pulling him against her chest. She wasn't using technique. She was using brute force to pull him out of the nightmare. "It is not real," she shouted, shaking him. "You are here. You are with me." Luther gasped, air rushing into his lungs. He was shaking violently, tears streaming down his face. "I left her. I left her behind." "You are not leaving anyone today," Sable said fiercely. She pulled his head down to her shoulder, burying her face in his neck. "Anchor Luther. Anchor to me." She began to purr. It wasn't the soft sound of a cat. It was a deep, resonant engine rumble that vibrated through his ribcage. Luther clung to her, his fingers digging into her fur. He focused on the sound, the vibration, the heat. Slowly, the hallucinations faded. The hydroponics bay returned. The red lights stopped spinning. Luther pulled back, gasping. He looked at Sable. She looked terrified, not for herself, but for him. "I saw ghosts," he whispered. "The veil storm shows us our failures." Sable set her hand, still gripping his arm tight. "I saw my matriarch, dying, over and over." "How did you stop it?" "I didn't," Sable whispered. "Junia did." Luther looked down. Junia was clinging to his leg, her eyes squeezed shut, humming a single unwavering note. She was acting as a counter-frequency, blocking the storm's chaotic signal. Before they could recover, a new sound cut through the chaos. A mechanical docking clamp, engaging. "Attention Ark survivors," a voice boomed. Not Orin, and not Aster. It was a voice of steel and command, amplified by military-grade speakers. "This is Matriarch Selene of the Philairi cruiser Talon. We have breached the airlock. Lay down your weapons." Sable went rigid. "Selene." The doors to the hydroponics bay were blasted open. Through the smoke stepped a dozen Philairi warriors in full void armor. They moved with lethal precision, weapons raised. In the center walked Matriarch Selene. She was older than Sable, her fur graying at the muzzle, her armor adorned with the intricate gold filigree of high command. She carried herself not just as a soldier, but as a queen. "Secure the area," Selene ordered. Her gaze swept the room, dismissing the humans and other aliens as if they were furniture. Her eyes landed on Sable. "Sable," Selene said, her voice softening imperceptibly. "You live." Sable stepped forward, her posture shifting to one of ingrained deference. She lowered her head. "Matriarch, I thought you were lost." "I survived," Selene said, stepping closer. "We have been tracking the Ark's signature for weeks. The veil storm makes it difficult." She looked at Junia, who was hiding behind Luther's legs. "And the child." "Good." Selene extended a hand. "Come. The Talon is docked. We have room for our own. We leave this wreck immediately." Sable took a step, then stopped. She looked back at Luther. She looked at Milo, at Garen, at the hundreds of terrified faces peering out from the foliage. "And them?" Sable asked. Selene glanced at Luther with cold indifference. "We are a stealth cruiser, Sable. Not a refugee transport. We have life support for 50. We take the Philairi. The rest have their own fate." Luther stepped forward, placing himself between Junia and the matriarch. "No," Luther said. His voice was shaking, but his feet were planted. Selene looked at him as if a roach had spoken. Excuse me, human. They are not cargo you can sort through, Luther said. We have a plan. We can save the Ark. We can save everyone. A plan, Selene scoffed. To fly a dead ship through a memory storm that is suicide. I am offering my kin life. Do not interfere. She looked at Sable. Sable, bring the child. Leave the human. He is a distraction. He is a liability. Sable looked at Selene, the leader she had failed, the woman she had worshipped. Then she looked at Luther, the man who had stitched her side, shared his water, and just moments ago clung to her for sanity. He is not a liability, Sable said quietly. What did you say? Selene's eyes narrowed. Sable raised her head. She did not bow this time. He is not a liability. He is my anchor. She moved back to Luther's side. She took his hand, interlacing her fingers with his, a gesture shocking to the Faliri warriors. We do not leave them, matriarch, Sable said firmly. If you take us, you take the Ark. You help us steer it, or we stay. Would you choose a human over your blood? Selene hissed, her hand drifting to her sidearm. I choose the pack, Sable said. And this, she gestured to the motley crew of prisoners. This is my pack now. Selene stared at them. The tension was razor-thin. The Faliri warriors tensed, waiting for the order to fire. Finally, Selene scoffed, dropping her hand. You have gone soft, Sable. The storm has addled your mind. She turned to her lieutenant. Hold the airlock. If they want to die on this rock, let them. But we do not leave until the storm passes. If the Ark breaks, we salvage what we can. She looked at Luther, with a gaze that promised violence if he failed. You say you can steer this thing, mechanic, then prove it. You have until the eye of the storm hits. 24 hours. The brig was a repurposed storage closet, reinforced with Garen's welding torch. Inside sat Curator Orin. He sat on a crate, impeccably calm, despite the dirt on his uniform. He watched Luther enter. The matriarch is a formidable woman, Orin observed pleasantly. But short-sighted. She thinks in terms of extraction. She does not understand transcendence. We are not trying to transcend Orin, Luther said, leaning against the doorframe. We are trying to not die. Are you? Orin tilted his head. You saw the storm, Luther. You felt the memories. The Veil Storm doesn't just destroy matter. It unravels time. To pass through it, you cannot just be a pilot. You must be a singular point of truth. A note so pure the chaos cannot disrupt it. You tried to force that note, Luther said. With the gas. With the pain. I tried to forge a weapon, Orin corrected. You are forging a family. It is inefficient. It is messy. Love is a variable that introduces error. Love is the only thing that holds the line when the math fails, Luther said. Orin smiled, a sad, knowing smile that chilled Luther to the bone. We shall see. But remember, Luther, when the song core opens fully, it will ask for everything. Make sure you have enough to give. The night cycle deepened. The ship was not quiet. The hull groaned constantly now, a sound like a submarine at crush depth. The Veil Storm was battering at the gates. In a secluded corner of the hydroponics bay, beneath the canopy of a giant fern, Luther lay on a pile of sleeping mats. He stared up at the UV lights, his mind racing with calculations, with fears, with the weight of 300 lives. He felt a weight settle on his chest. Junia had crawled over. She didn't ask. She simply curled up on top of him, a small ball of fur and warmth. She placed her head under his chin. Then Sable moved. She lay down on his right side, pressing her back against his flank, her head resting on his shoulder. Her arm draped across his chest, her hand resting over Junia's. It was heavy. It was hot. It was uncomfortable. And it was perfect. Luther exhaled, the tension leaking out of his muscles. We are going to die tomorrow, aren't we? He whispered into the dark. Shut up, Luther, Sable murmured, her eyes already closed. Okay, Luther closed his eyes. Junia began to purr. A soft, rhythmic thrum. Sable joined in deeper, stronger. Luther's heart slowed to match them. Thump, thump, purr, rumble. Thump, thump, purr, rumble. And then something miraculous happened. The groaning of the ship stopped. The vibrating floor plates settled. The rattling leaves went still. The Ark, sensing the resonance, the pure, unforced harmony of three beings sleeping in a tangled pile of trust, responded. The song corps, miles away in the center of the ship, picked up the rhythm. It amplified it. It broadcast it to the hull plating. The ship began to hum a counter note, a lullaby. Outside, the Veilstorm raged, but inside the hydroponics bay, under the fern, there was only the sound of breathing. Luther drifted off to sleep, pinned beneath the weight of the alien catgirls, thinking that if this was how the world ended, it wasn't a bad way to go. The arrival of the Veilstorm was not an event of weather. It was an event of physics, undoing itself. It began with the silence, the constant, subsonic thrum of the Lattice Ark's engines, a vibration that had become as familiar as their own heartbeats suddenly vanished. For one terrifying second, the universe held its breath. Then the sky tore open. Outside the reinforced viewports of the command deck, the stars did not merely twinkle. They screamed. They elongated, stretching into infinite ribbons of violent violet and bruised gold smearing across the void like wet paint on a spinning canvas. The metal of the ship began to sing a high, resonant frequency that caused teeth to ache and vision to blur. It sounded like a billion glass bells shattering at once. "Gravity shear detected," Astor's synthesized voice cut through the air, pitched high with panic. "Hull integrity is failing in sectors 4, 9, and 12. The reality coefficient is dropping below 0.7. 0.7! Milo shrieked, clutching a stanchion, as the floor tilted 30 degrees. "What does that mean? Are we imaginary now? I do not want to be imaginary. I have distinct texture." "It means," Luther said, gripping the console of the song corps, "that the past is about to start bleeding into the present." He looked at the crew he had assembled. They were terrified. The prisoners huddled in the corridors leading to the core were clutching their heads, moaning as memories that did not belong to this moment assaulted them. A large reptilian inmate was weeping, calling out the name of a hatchling dead for 20 years. "We have to move," Luther shouted over the rising din. "Now get them to the core." Matriarch Selene stood by the blast doors, her armored boots magnetized to the deck. She watched her warriors struggle to maintain formation as the ship groaned. She looked at Sable, then at Junia, and finally at Luther. "This is madness!" Selene shouted, her voice barely audible over the screaming metal. "The ship is fracturing. We should be in the pods." "The pods will be crushed like eggshells," Luther yelled back. He grabbed Junia's hand. The small Falleri was trembling so violently, her teeth chattered. "The Ark is designed to surf this wave, not hide from it, but it needs a pilot." He looked at Sable. She was pale, her pupils blown wide, fighting the urge to curl into a ball. The Veilstorm was hitting her harder than anyone. For a Falleri, whose senses were tuned to the vibration of the universe, this was deafening. "Sable," Luther's voice was a command. "Eyes on me," Sable snapped her head toward him. "We are going in," Luther said. "Anchor to me." He dragged them toward the center of the song corps. The room was a maelstrom of light. The crystalline pillars were strobing wildly, reacting to the chaotic data flooding the sensors. As they passed, Selene, the matriarch, stepped forward to block them. Her hand hovered over her sidearm. "You cannot control it," Selene hissed. "You are human. You are deaf to the song." Before Luther could answer, the ship lurched violently. A piece of ceiling plating gave way, crashing down meters from them. Junia let out a whimper, a high, melodic sound of pure distress. Luther didn't flinch. He squeezed Junia's hand, and instinctively he hummed. It was a low, discordant note, something he used to do when fixing engines, but it was steady. Junia latched onto it. She began to purr. Sable, sensing the rhythm, joined in her chest, rumbling with a deep defensive bass. The three of them created a pocket of sound, and as they passed the matriarch, the chaotic strobing lights of the hallway stabilized. The flickering blue calmed to a steady pulse. The groaning metal near them quieted. Celine's eyes widened. She saw it. She saw the resonance field forming around the human, not because he was powerful, but because he was the center of gravity for the two Faliri. "Let them pass," Celine ordered her guards, her voice filled with a stunned reluctance. She looked at Luther with a new, calculating expression. "If he fails, kill him before the storm takes us." The entrance to the Songkor was blocked by a mob. Garen was there holding back a surge of terrified prisoners. But they weren't trying to escape. They were trying to get to the prisoner in the center of the circle. They had Curator Orin. Two massive inmates held the curator by his arms. Orin's uniform was torn, his face bruised, but he was laughing a manic broken sound. "Kill him!" a voice shouted from the back. "He did this! He locked the navigation!" "Blood for blood!" another screamed. Garen looked ready to let them do it. He raised his heavy metal wrench. "He starved us. He gassed us. He deserves to go out the airlock before we do." "Stop!" Luther's shout cracked through the room. He pushed through the crowd, Sable and Junia flanking him like bodyguards. He stepped between Garen and Orin. "Get out of the way, mechanic," Garen growled. "This is justice." "This is panic," Luther retorted. He looked at Orin. The curator's eyes were locked on Luther's, filled with a strange, terrifying expectation. "If we kill him now," Luther said, addressing the crowd, "we are just doing what he wanted. We are becoming the animals he treated us like." "He is a monster," Milo yelled, though he was hiding behind a crate. "Yes," Luther said, "he is. But if I let you tear him apart, what happens to you? What happens to us? I need you to man the escape pods, not run a slaughterhouse." Luther looked at Garen. "Lock him up. Put him in the maintenance cage. If we die, he dies with us. If we live, he answers for it properly." Garen stared at Luther. The big man's chest heaved. He looked at the wrench in his hand, then at the blood on Orin's face. He lowered the weapon. "Cage him," Garen spat. "But if we survive mechanic, I want to hear the sentence myself." As they dragged Orin away, the curator did not struggle. He leaned in as he passed Luther, his voice a harsh whisper. "You are soft, Luther. You think mercy is a strength. The Veilstorm will burn that out of you." "We will see," Luther said. He turned to the console. The Songkor was waiting. Stepping into the interface of the Songkor during a Veilstorm was not like piloting a ship. It was like stepping into the firing line of a psychic firing squad. Luther placed his hands on the surface. Sable placed hers on his right shoulder. Junia pressed her small hands against his lower back. Connection. The world dissolved. There was no room, no ship, only white blinding fire. Luther gasped, his mouth opening in a silent scream. The Veilstorm didn't just attack the hull. It attacked the mind. It sought out the cracks in the psyche and pried them open with a crowbar of cold light. The hallucination. Luther was standing on the bridge of a pristine ship. He was wearing a uniform white gold immaculate. He looked down at his hands. They were clean. No grease, no scars. Below him on the view screen, a planet was burning. "It was necessary," a voice said. It was his voice. Luther turned. Standing next to him was Orin. But it wasn't Orin. It was Luther, older, harder. "We had to cut the weight," the mirror Luther said. "To save the Ark. We had to jettison the cargo." Luther looked at the cargo manifest. It listed names: Milo, Garen, Aster, and at the bottom, Sable, Junia. "No," Luther whispered. "They were feral," Mirror Luther said coldly. "They were unpredictable. You cannot steer a civilization with wild animals. You did the math, Luther. You always do the math. 1 life for 1,000. Luther looked down. At his feet lay Junia. She wasn't moving. "Did I do this?" "You survived," Mirror Luther smiled. "Isn't that the point? The shift?" Sable was running. She was back in the forest of her homeworld. The smell of pine and blood was thick. She was hunting. Her hunger was a living thing, a red haze that covered her vision. She saw the prey, small, weak, limping. She pounced. Her claws sank into soft flesh. She felt the snap of bone. The prey cried out. "Lou there!" Sable froze. The red haze cleared. Beneath her paws was not a deer. It was Junia. And shielding Junia was the human, his throat torn open by her own claws. "You are a beast," a voice whispered from the trees. It was Matriarch Selene. "You destroy everything you touch." Sable howled, the sound ripping from her soul. The anchor. "I am afraid." The voice cut through the white fire. It wasn't a thought. It was a shout. Real Luther in the real songcore was screaming. "I am afraid," Luther yelled. His eyes squeezed shut, tears streaming down his face. "I do not know what I am doing. I am just a mechanic. I am scared of failing you." The admission shattered the perfection of the hallucination. The mirror. Luther flickered. "I am not a captain." Luther sobbed, his hands gripping the console until his knuckles cracked. "I am just a guy who fixes broken things, and I am terrified that I am the one who is broken." A hand tightened on his shoulder. "Then be broken." Sable's voice came through the void. It was fierce, raw, and real. "We are all broken, Luther. That is how the pieces fit together." Sable had broken out of her own nightmare. She pressed her forehead against the back of his neck. "I am a killer," she confessed, her voice shaking. "But I choose not to kill you. I choose to hold you." Then the rhythm came. Junia, the smallest of them, the one who had no words, had found the one thing the storm couldn't fake. A heartbeat. She was humming. It was the same tune she had heard Luther hum earlier, a clumsy, off-key fragment of an old Earth lullaby. She was humming it back to him, amplifying it through the songcore. It acted as a lighthouse beam in the fog. Luther focused on it. 1, 2, 3, 4. "Okay," Luther breathed. "Okay." He opened his eyes. The white fire receded. He saw the data streams of the arc. They were chaotic red and angry knots of turbulence. "Sable," Luther said, his voice steadying. "I need your anger, but focus it. Be the engine." "I am the engine," Sable growled, pouring her adrenaline into the link. "Junia," Luther whispered. "Be the rudder. Keep the beat." Junia purred louder, a sonic frequency that stabilized the data stream. "And I," Luther said, gripping the controls, "will be the hands." He didn't fight the storm. He didn't try to plow through it. He did what a salvage operator did best. He looked for the currents. He looked for the drift. "Turning," Luther announced. "Hard to port, into the shear." "Into it," Selene's voice came over the comms, panicked. "You will tear us apart." "Trust the bond," Luther shouted. He shoved the virtual controls forward. The arc groaned. The entire structure twisted. The sound of metal screaming reached a crescendo. And then silence. The ship slipped into the slipstream of the Veilstorm. They weren't fighting the waves anymore. They were surfing them. The resonance of the three human warrior feral created a harmonic shield that deflected the memory distortion waves. The stars outside stopped screaming. They blurred into streaks of light. "We are moving," Astor's voice buzzed, filled with awe. "Velocity increasing. We are exiting the anomaly." "Hold it!" Luther gritted his teeth. The physical strain was immense. He felt like his nerves were being used as copper wiring. Just a little longer. Suddenly, the console flashed red. "Override detected," the computer announced. "Pheromone dispersion initiated. Sector core." The vents in the song core hissed. The pink mist, concentrated, thick, and potent, flooded the room. Orin. Even from the cage, he had triggered a failsafe. "No!" Selene shouted from the doorway, raising her mask. But Luther didn't let go. Sable didn't let go. Junia didn't let go. The mist washed over them. The chemical designed to strip away higher thought, to force a feral, violent coupling or combat, filled their lungs. Luther took a breath. He tasted the sweetness. He felt the chemical burn in his blood, urging him to turn, to grab, to dominate. He looked at Sable. Her pupils dilated. She looked at him. But there was no violence. There was no feral madness, because they were already bonded. The chemical had nothing to bridge. The connection was already absolute. "Is that all you have got?" Luther whispered to the ghost of Orin in the machine. Instead of tearing each other apart, they held tighter. The mist, finding no resistance to overcome, simply acted as a stimulant. It sharpened their focus. It made the colors brighter. "Push!" Luther roared. With a final unified surge of will, they threw the Ark out of the Veilstorm. The sensation of exiting the storm was like breaking the surface of the ocean after holding your breath for 2 minutes. The violet chaos vanished. The stars settled into steady, hard points of light. The groaning of the ship ceased, replaced by the comforting low thrum of the standby engines. "We are clear," Astor said. "We are in open space." Luther slumped against the console. His legs gave way. Sable caught him, lowering him gently to the deck. Junia collapsed on top of them, instantly asleep. "We did it," Luther whispered, staring up at the ceiling. "We didn't die." The comms channel crackled. "This is Garen." The voice was rough, choked with emotion. "The pods we didn't launch. We watched the stars move. You crazy son of a gun. You actually did it." "1 star," Milo's voice piped up in the background. "1 star review. The ride was bumpy, the snacks were terrible, and the pilot was emotional. Would not recommend." Laughter. It rippled through the ship. It was the sound of 300 people realizing they had a tomorrow. An hour later, the main hangar bay was a bustle of activity. The Talon Celine's cruiser was docked. Celine stood by the airlock, her helmet under her arm. She looked at the motley crew of the Ark, the prisoners, the refugees, the mismatched family. "The Ark is damaged," Celine said to Luther, who was leaning heavily on Sable. "It will take months to repair the FTL drives fully, but it is space-worthy." She looked at Sable. "The offer stands, shield-bearer. You, the child and the human. You have earned a place on the Talon. You can leave this flying wreckage. You can live in comfort. We have medical bays. We have real food." She paused, her eyes hardening slightly. "But only you 3. I cannot take a prison population. They will tax our resources. We are a warship, not a colony." It was the ultimatum, the golden ticket. Luther looked at the clean, gleaming interior of the Faliri cruiser. He smelled the filtered, sterile air. Then he looked back at the hydroponics bay. He saw Garen helping a wounded insectoid. He saw Milo trying to teach Astor how to play cards. He saw the community they had built in the mud and the blood. "No," Luther said. Celine blinked. "No. You called me the Chosen because I could pilot the ship," Luther said, straightening up, wincing at the pain in his back. "But I didn't pilot it. We did. And that," he pointed to the prisoners, "is the crew that kept the engine running." He looked at Sable. "I am staying. This wreck-it's a garden now. It needs a gardener." Sable looked at her matriarch. For a moment the old loyalty flared, but then she looked at Luther's hand hanging by his side. She reached out and took it. "The shield-bearer stays with the anchor," Sable said simply. Junia, standing by Luther's leg, let out a sharp hiss at Celine and hugged Luther's knee. Celine stared at them for a long moment. Finally, a small, grudging smile touched her lips. "Feral," she muttered, but the word lacked its usual sting. "You are all feral. Keep your wreck then. But if you die out here, do not say I didn't warn you." She turned and marched into her ship. The airlock hissed shut. "Where is Orin?" The question came from Sable, as the Talon detached and sped away. "He is in the Song Corps," Luther said, a sudden heaviness settling in his gut. "He broke out of the cage during the transition. Aster said he went back to the source." They ran. When they entered the Song Corps, it was dark. The crystalline pillars were dim. Orin was sitting at the base of the console. He was slumped over, his breathing shallow. He had removed his mask, the sleek silver faceplate he always wore. Luther stopped. He felt the blood drain from his face. Sable gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The face beneath the mask was old. It was lined with decades of stress and exposure to radiation. A thick, white beard covered the jaw. One eye was milky with a cataract. But the structure, the nose, the brow, the set of the cheekbones. And on the right forearm, exposed by the rolled-up sleeve of the uniform, was a scar. A faint, white line. It was the exact same shape as the scratch Sable had given Luther in the cell 5 days ago. Orin opened his good eye. He looked at Luther. "Hello, me," Orin wheezed. "How?" Luther whispered, falling to his knees beside the dying man. "How is this possible?" "The Veil Storm," Orin coughed, blood speckling his lips. "It doesn't just eat space. It eats time. I didn't make the turn, Luther. The first time I didn't make the turn." He reached out a shaking hand. "I panicked. I didn't trust them. I tried to pilot it alone. I crashed. We were stuck in the Veil for 40 years. Everyone died. Sable, Junia, everyone." He looked at Sable, tears leaking from his blind eye. "I watched you die of infection, Sable. I watched Junia starve." "So you went back?" Luther asked, his voice trembling. "The Ark spat me out," Orin whispered. "At the beginning. But I was old. I was broken. I knew I couldn't do it again. I had to be the villain. I had to be the pressure." He gripped Luther's wrist. His grip was weak, like a bird's claw. "I had to make you hate me enough to love them," Orin rasped. "I had to force the bond because kindness is too slow. I didn't have time." "You were wrong," Luther said, tears streaming down his face. "Kindness was the only thing strong enough." Orin smiled. It was the first genuine smile Luther had seen on the man's face. "I know," Orin whispered. "That is why you are better than me." He looked at Sable. "I am sorry. For the cage. For the gas." Sable knelt. She didn't growl. She reached out and placed her hand on his forehead. "The cage is open," she said softly. Orin exhaled. A long, rattling breath. "Do not become the curator," he breathed. And then he was gone. Epilogue 48. Hours later. The medical bay was quiet. The hum of the recyclers was a gentle, rhythmic sound. Captain Garen's self-appointed pending election stood by the door with Milo and Aster. They peered through the observation glass. "Is he alive?" Milo whispered. "Vital signs are stable," Aster buzzed, checking a datapad. "He slept for 30 hours straight. Exhaustion levels were critical." Inside the room, the lights were dim to a soft amber. Luther was lying on the main biobed. He was still wearing his battered jacket, though someone had taken his boots off. He was fast asleep. His face relaxed, the lines of worry finally smoothed out. But he wasn't alone. Curled up on his chest, occupying the space between his chin and his stomach, were 2 Faliri. Junia was a tight ball of gray fur, her head tucked under Luther's chin, her hand gripping his collar. She was snoring softly, a high whistling sound. Sable was draped more protectively, her head resting on Luther's shoulder, her arm thrown across his torso, as if to hold him down or keep him safe. Her deep, resonant purr was audible, even through the glass. It vibrated through the bed frame. It vibrated through Luther. Every time the purr hit a certain frequency, the monitors on the wall pulsed in sync. The ship's diagnostic screen in the corner showed the hull integrity stabilizing, fueled by the localized resonance in the medbay. Garen shook his head, a grin, splitting his weathered face. "Look at that," Garen chuckled, turning to walk away. "We spent 100 years looking for a power source to cross the galaxy. Milo nodded, wiping a smudge from the glass. And it turns out the strongest energy source in the universe is just being a really good pillow. Human superpower, Aster agreed, closing the door quietly. Thermal regulation and emotional anchoring, highly efficient. Inside the room, Luther shifted in his sleep. He didn't wake up. He just wrapped an arm around Sable and rested his chin on Junia's head. The Ark drifted through the quiet stars, guided by the sound of 3 hearts beating as one.